So what would you say when it comes to a fair amount to tax an individual? What is your opinion on that?
An individual of what income?
That's a good question. So for instance, in the UK, I think if you earn over 50,000 a year sterling, you get taxed 40%, which I think is too high, personally. And I think if you're taxed over 100K, then you get 50%, which is a very high taxation rate.
And if the effective tax rate is probably even higher.
Yeah.
So I can speak. So in the United States, there's the federal taxes, and then some states have a state income tax. Some don't.
David Pakman was a guest on the Triggernometry podcast for a debate that was about an hour long or so, and I think they had a great discussion. So I wanted to share some clips with you guys if you haven't seen them yet. We're going to take a look, and I'll chime in every once in a while with some thoughts. Let's hop back into it.
My view, first of all, before we even talk about changing the tax rates, is that tax money is dramatically misallocated in the US. So I think the US spends way too much on military and defense. There are guaranteed contracts given where we just replace unused weapons. They're sort of given like an expiration date, and then the government just keeps buying and buying. The tentacles of military bases around the world, to me, is totally overblown for the safety and security of the United States. So before even talking about changing the current tax rates, I think that money that's already coming in should be used in a very different way. And maybe you wouldn't even need to change tax rates at all. Now, if changes were to be made to tax rates, I would like to see some higher brackets created. Right now, the top tax bracket in the US starts, I actually don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's around $500,000 a year in income. To me, the difference between someone making $500,000 a year, $5 million a year, and $1 billion a year is very different. And so I think we need more tax rates. And, maybe it would be at $2 million a year. Right now, the top tax rate's 37%, just for context, so you guys know. Maybe at $2 million a year, you go to 39%. And maybe at 20 million bucks a year, you go to 42%. I mean, I'm not in the mindset of we need a 90% top tax rate or anything like that. I just think we need some higher brackets, because what you have in the US is that the very, very richest, not the 1%, not the 0.5%, but like the 0.1%, pay a lower effective tax rate than people who earn less. That doesn't seem right. But again, but there might be the belief that people like me are talking about 60, 70% tax rates. I'm not talking about that.
David Pakman really hits the nail on the head when talking about tax rates. He mentions Warren Buffett, who pointed out that he pays a lower percentage in taxes than a secretary. That really shows a big problem here in the US, where we're getting way less for our tax dollars compared to other industrialized countries. Pakman really emphasizes that the US tax system doesn't give us the same benefits that other countries do. Like in Spain, even though the tax rates are similar, they get all sorts of healthcare perks, including maternity and paternity leave. Honestly, many Americans, including myself, would be totally okay with paying a bit more in taxes if it meant getting access to Medicare or something like it. We just don't get enough bang for our buck with our taxes compared to other places. Let's fast forward to their conversation about populism versus social democracy next.
And what do you make of populism and the rise of populism? Do you see that as a problem, which I do? And this is, I don't know where I would identify myself now, but this is my opinion. I think a lot of populism was created by the left, by the more progressive elements of left-wing politics and politicians, essentially turning their back on working class people and not representing them, certainly in my own country, in the UK, with the Labour Party.
So I completely disagree with that analysis as applied to the United States. But the problem I have with populism is that populism fundamentally is rhetoric more than it is policy. And so when I talk about social democracy, without explaining policy, there's a pretty well-established set of policies that go along with that, some of which I might agree with and some of which I might disagree with, and what works in Sweden may not work in Denmark or might work in the United States or it might not. The pernicious part for me about populism is that it's fundamentally a rhetoric. And rhetoric, particularly in a country with such educational problems as the United States, such lack of media literacy and critical thinking, can be used by bad actors to convince people to support really bad candidates. Trump used a version of populist rhetoric. He was, China's screwing us, the working class, I'm going to fix it, etc. The problem with populist rhetoric, absent a really clear vision of policy, is that you put in someone into power based on their rhetoric, and all of a sudden the solutions they propose are wacky. Like, for example, Tucker Carlson is a propagandist on Fox News who uses populist rhetoric. But all of a sudden, when you say, well, what's a solution? You've got to prevent Antifa from taking your house, or brown people from Mexico are taking your job and we've got to stop that. So a lot of the same rhetoric we hear from the left and right that sounds populist is used in different ways. And so for me, I take more of a policy-oriented approach of social democracy, and I'm not big on populist rhetoric myself.
You know, David Pakman brings up a really good point, and I think the Triggernometry guys have some valid thoughts too. The Democratic Party is kind of struggling, just like the Labour Party in the UK. They mention how Hillary Clinton lost the election partly because she didn't really connect with those working class folks in the Midwest. A lot of them felt left behind, and she didn't pick up on that at all. Then you have Donald Trump, who really tapped into that feeling. He made it seem like he was fighting for them, even if he wasn't being totally honest about it. But a lot of people believed he had their backs. And then in the 2020 election, it got even more interesting with Bernie Sanders and Trump both running as populists. There were actually polls showing that some people liked Trump as their first choice and Sanders as their second. It really shows that these voters weren't so much about the policies. They just wanted to feel like someone was on their side. They also dive into what social democracy means in all of this. Let's check that out next.
Did I describe you correctly as a progressive commentator? Is that a fair way to describe you?
That's how I describe myself, as a sort of standard progressive in the Northern European mold. There are people who say I am a communist socialist, and I'm definitely not. There are people who say I'm a centrist establishment shill, which I'm definitely not. I'm just uncontroversially sort of like a Northern European social democrat.
Right. So what does that mean exactly? What do you want?
So this is a form of capitalism, right? So strictly speaking, if we start with a sort of just black-white, is my view a view that it falls under capitalism? The answer is yes. And social democracy is a well-regulated form of capitalism where we say there's lots of good things about capitalism and about markets directing resources in many areas. But there are some what we would call special cases, and these might, depending on who you ask, include healthcare. They might include education and other what we call public goods. And in those cases, we don't want to let the free market, or a supposedly free market, as is often the case, direct resources. And in order to fund those public goods, we would use taxes. You're still allowed to make a ton of money. You can still become very wealthy, but we would use some of the top wealth to say, let's fund these special areas that we would say are exceptions to free market capitalism.
Things like healthcare, for example, which is pretty much what we do here in Britain. I find that all entirely uncontroversial. I think where some of the controversies might start to come in is the cultural side. What does it mean to be culturally progressive, if you are?
All right, let's pause for a moment, because there's a big difference between the US and places like Europe and Canada that a lot of people here just don't get. This ties into what David Pakman was saying about media literacy. In the US, Republicans have this tendency to label anything they don't like as communist or socialist. It's pretty wild. The hosts on Triggernometry mentioned that in the UK, having a public healthcare system like the NHS is seen as non-controversial. Most people there, aside from the far right, view the NHS as a fundamental right, not as some form of communism. Contrast that with the US, where right-wingers are eager to dismantle our limited public healthcare systems. Medicare only covers folks over 65. And Medicaid is for the poor, but we don't have a universal system for everyone. The idea of universal healthcare being labeled as communist is just insane. But in America, it gets thrown around all the time. Even mainstream media like CNN play into this by echoing those right-wing talking points, constantly asking, how do you pay for it whenever universal healthcare comes up?
I think one of the issues is that these are not necessarily major issues for folks like me. And so one of the things I try to do is not delve too deeply into opining about positions or defending positions which are not mine. So I guess what I want to say is there's a lot of what I believe are fabricated culture wars. I can speak to the United States, and because that's where my knowledge is. In the United States, there have been, in the absence of policy for what I call the American right wing, which includes the Republican Party, but it also includes right wing people who don't really care about the Republican Party. Many Trumpists were never voters before Trump, so it doesn't have to be Republicans. But the American right wing has given up on policy. They don't really talk about taxes anymore. They don't really talk about immigration reform. They take a cultural approach. And part of that is framing the left as being obsessed with identity politics and all these different things. These things exist on the left. They're not really my cup of tea. And so I don't have a huge interest in defending some of those aspects. For me, I have cultural views, but they're not the primary element of my politics.
Do you mind if I ask you what they are, though?
So, what do you think about all this? I really dig these kinds of discussions, and honestly, I wish we could see more of them in mainstream media. David Pakman had some great points with the Triggernometry guys about how a Northern European system mixes capitalism with a better social safety net. And it's definitely not communism. It's frustrating to see the Republicans and even some Democrats like Joe Manchin calling these ideas socialism. We need more real talk about these issues, especially on places like CNN, where anything left of center often gets sidelined. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those clips with Pakman. If you're curious, you can check out the full discussion on the Triggernometry YouTube channel. Pakman really holds his own with these smart, reasonable folks, which is a nice change of pace. Drop your comments below, whether it's about Pakman, the Triggernometry crew, or anything else from this video. And if you liked what you saw, please hit that like button and subscribe.